In this lesson, we will continue discussing the coming divisions over slavery in the United States. To recap the previous sections in terms of things that you need to know for better understanding Chapter 12, I want to remind you of the following. First, the South does remain primarily agricultural. Very few mills in the South developing between 1820 and 1850. However, the South is becoming much more reliant on slave labor. Importantly, we see the number of plantations to grow between the 1820s and the 1840s. As the number of plantations are growing, it is important to remember that at the height of slavery, only 3% of Southerners had large plantations. So only 3% of Southerners had more than 50 slaves. About 17% of Southerners had between 3 and 6 slaves on the average, but less than 10 slaves. So the majority of folks living in the South, 80%, do not own slaves. And this is really important when we consider the social dynamic of the South. You have a very small population that's very wealthy. And then you have a larger population that's not as wealthy. But the majority of people are low-income earners. They're very poor. They might be yeoman farmers. They might be recent immigrants to the southern states, particularly the Scottish, the Irish, German immigrants into the United States, and as well as free blacks. But most of these people are landless laborers, so they are very poor, and they might also work on a plantation as a laborer. So these things are important to keep in mind. As these changes are taking place in the South, the North is beginning to build more factories, more mills, and increase their demand in the product of slave labor, which is primarily cotton, other products as well, but primarily cotton. And as their demand is increasing, then the reliance on slave labor will continue. These products that are produced in northern mills are sold across the country, back to the South, into the West, also in the North, but also importantly, they are sold internationally as well. So in a lot of ways, the entire globe is depending on the products that are being churned out from the South. One of the important decisions that was reached after the Constitution was agreed upon was that this very delicate balance of power would be in place, and we would have, the same number of slave states and the same number of free states, and this would keep Congress equally balanced so that the southern states as well as the northern states were equally powerful and did not lose any control in Congress. As we look west and we pull in new states, first Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, we find that many of the people moving into the Western territories are either opposed to slavery or undecided on the issue of slavery. Now, the rule of the territories, so the land that the United States has control of but is not an actual state. The rule of the territories was that the territories would be free. However, any runaway slave or fugitive slave would have to be returned to his or her master regardless. And so this, of course, protected slavery, and it appeased the Southern slaveholders. Now, as we continue to inch into the West, we'll have new states that need to come into the country, and their kind of fate on slavery will need to be decided. So that brings us to Chapter 12, Imperial Ambitions and Sectional Crises. So as we're moving into the Western Territory, we are traveling what's called the Overland Trail. And this travel on these different trails really increases after the 1830s. Remember 1831, we see Nat Turner's Rebellion. We see a lot of folks in northern as well as southern states looking for new opportunities, whether that is new opportunities to express themselves religiously, new opportunities to seek out their own wealth, their own land, to have their own adventures, to carve out a new life for their family. A lot of people of diverse backgrounds are traveling west. There were a lot of very encouraging letters that were sent to relatives and family members in the East, particularly missionaries like the Whitmans and the Spaldings send back letters saying that, the land is beautiful, it is vast, it is virtually uninhabited. Now, when they say virtually uninhabited, they're really only considering folks who look like them. If you recall, the natives have been pushed into these Western territories as well. There were a lot of possibilities for new opportunities in the West, particularly after that Panic of 1837, when people began to say maybe we need to move west and see what's out there. We need new opportunities, we need new sources of wealth, new sources of land. By 1860, over 350,000 Americans had journeyed what was known as the Oregon Trail. This vastly expanded the American empire. If you talk to someone, old like me, in their late 30s and 40s, ask them about playing the Oregon Trail when they were in elementary school. And the reality of the Oregon Trail is that it was highly romanticized, but it was incredibly dangerous. Many people died along the Oregon Trail. Many people were absorbed into native communities, literally starved to death, literally froze to death. So the reality of Western migration is not romantic. The expense of the trip meant that most of those who were traveling west came from middle class families. So the poorest people really could not travel west unless they sort of indebted themselves to someone who could pay their dues and then work off that contract once they got to the Western Territory. Additionally, 60% of those who travel west are men. Not surprising, right? This is an opportunity for men to seek out new opportunities and to sort of earn their own fortunes. California initially only had a limited number of American settlers coming into the territory. Most of those who did married into wealthy Mexican ranching families. Now, this is particularly important because remember, California does not belong to the United States. California is settled by folks from what we know of today as Mexico. And those Mexican ranching families will still be in power and in place in chapter 15 and chapter 16, which is covered in American history too, as we bring sort of new opportunities into California. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. This, of course, resulted in a massive population boom. People from all across the United States rushed to California, to the mountains, to hopefully find gold, to extract wealth, to get rich very quickly. These people were called the 49ers, so they came pretty quickly, within just a few months of the gold being discovered. This massive, massive influx in people exacerbated the existing tensions in the area between the newly arrived whites and the people who were already living in California, those Mexican ranchers, as well as, importantly, the local Indians who lived in the area, who had fragile but relatively peaceful relationships with the Mexican ranchers. At the same time, we see this very delicate balance of power, this fragile relationship, become even more complicated by an increase in immigration from Asia and South America. Everyone, of course, is coming to the area of the United States, of California, for one reason, and that is, of course, to find wealth. Domestic and health needs of the miners created some work opportunities for women. Um, Working in mines is not only incredibly dangerous physically, but it's also very, very dangerous for your health with the things that you are breathing in. Dust, gold, dirt, explosives, corrosives, those sorts of things. The opportunities that are created for women are one, to find a husband who hopefully will find gold, but also to work as launderers, seamstresses, and in other professions. But as a result, we see exploitation, particularly of non-white women, becoming the byproduct or the consequence of this gold rush and this explosion. Native women in the western part of the United States have historically been the largest ethnic group of women to be trafficked in this area, even through to more recent times. And when I say trafficked, if you're unclear what I mean, in 1848 and 1849, is that they are primarily either sex workers or victims of rape. Chinese men also fell victim to violence and theft. They, as a result of this, turned to domestic labor, specifically doing laundry and cooking as a way to earn a living. As you are aware, many Chinese men are smaller in stature than their white immigrant counterparts, particularly the Germans, Scotch Irish men who are much bigger, much broader. And so for Chinese men, they recognize that they are going to be victims of physical abuse and assault, and so they try to adapt and survive as best they can. Levi Strauss, who was a German Jewish immigrant, made his fortune by producing denim pants. So if you're wearing a pair of Levi Strauss jeans today, then you are wearing a piece of American history. That is probably one of the most iconic things that we think of. Westward expansion, of course, brought new settlers into the territories and the U.S. government who are in this area. They become in conflict with the powerful Indian nations. If you remember, after the revolution, the native groups who maybe had historically not really been friendly with one another create what's called a pan-Indian alliance. And they do this as a way to survive, to protect themselves from this new government, this new American government that is very powerful and has very big guns. And so these pan-Indian alliances view an attack on one as an attack on all. Now, the new settlers in the area, as well as the government, so two different groups, begin to view natives as an enemy. And so the natives now have two sort of enemies that they need to fight. We see conflict between the whites and the Indians, and that will continue to intensify as more and more settlers come into the territory. Of course, the U.S. government is willing to protect the settlers as they are moving into the Western Territory because that protects their own land interests. Violence erupts in several instances, particularly when Marcus and Nerissa Whitman and 10 other settlers are killed by natives in retaliation for a deadly measles epidemic. Now, natives, rightfully so, recognize that settlers bring with them certain diseases to which the natives had never been exposed to, so which they were not immune to. And they view them as bringing this, and so they respond very violently and kill these settlers. Settlers, though, very rarely distinguish between friendly Indians and violent Indians. They, very racist in their mindset, would say a red man, regardless of their tribe and their beliefs, is a savage, is an enemy. And so they don't really make a distinction. And so, in instances where one tribe might attack, they would attack another tribe who may have been friendly, who may have had nothing to do with the initial attack. Um, at the same time that we're seeing this increase in attacks, we also see a lot of environmental changes on the plains. Part of those environmental changes being natural changes that take place, and part of those changes being a direct result of this massive, massive migration. Environmental changes, diseases from white settlers, and then intra-tribal conflict between various native groups, um, sort of competing for power. All of these things take place between the 1840s and the 1850s, and this really kind of creates a perfect storm, if you will. At the same time, we see the plight of the Comanche Nation. If you recall from chapter 11, I believe, maybe chapter 10, the Comanches had sort of been protecting parts of Texas and Mexico from others, whether those others were white settlers or other native groups. And they did this in um, they did this for the benefit of being paid some form of tribute, whether it was gold, food, livestock, those kinds of things. Um, However, the Comanches do become very, very powerful. However, as they become more powerful and more spread out, they are overextended in the Comanche Empire. This overextension, right, because we have more and more people coming into the territories, and so the Comanches will need to spread out in order to protect the land. This um, overextension combined with a depopulation of bison, which again is the primary source of diet and cultural livelihood for the Comanche, really causes the Comanche Empire to collapse. Anytime there's a collapse in power, historically, since the beginning of time to the present day, anytime we see a collapse in power, we see what's called a power vacuum. And that vacuum, that void, has to be filled by another powerful force. Otherwise, we have a lot of bickering, a lot of chaos in the territories. And so what happens is a reigniting of these native groups who've kind of developed this very fragile peace with one another, all trying to clamber to the top to maintain power, while at the same time fighting these settlers coming into the Western Territory and ultimately the United States military, the United States government, attempting to protect the settlers and increase the size of their territory. So there's this very romanticized view of traveling west, right? Go west, young man, find your fortune. But the reality is that the western areas in the 1820s, the 1830s, the 1840s, even though we find gold, the reality is that the western territory is very volatile um, and not particularly a good place to live. At the same time, importantly, African Americans are part of Western expansion. In some cases, willingly. Some African Americans, free or enslaved, embark west with the hope of being able to be free, to have independence, and to have wealth. In many cases, African Americans are brought to the Western Territory by force. Some settlers do own slaves and do move into the Western Territory, bringing with them their slaves. But importantly, Creek Indians, who also own slaves, um, are moving away from white settlers and bringing with them into the Western Territory slaves as well. Here on this map, you can see all of the different trails. This is what we mean when we talk about these overland trails that are coming from areas here in the east and making their way to different parts of California, different parts of what becomes Oregon up here, and Washington. At the same time, in this sort of pink color, we see the names of different native tribes that are on these plains areas as well. So it's important to keep in mind that in addition to the harshness of the trail, right, that the settlers are coming into conflict with a lot of different native groups, some that are peaceful, some that are violent, but all that are really just trying to survive and preserve their way of life. So as we're expanding into the Western Territory, the question of statehood almost immediately arises. And so in 1849, 1 year after gold is discovered in California, California applies for admission to the Union or to the United States as a free state. Now, this, of course, brings immediate protest from Southerners who recognize that this admission of California as a free state will immediately tip the delicate balance of power between the free states and the slaveholding states in the Union. And so Southerners are immediately opposed to this, California being admitted as a free state. So in response to this, President Zachary Taylor suggests that slavery's expansion be allowed throughout the West. And this, of course, angers the Northern Whigs, who are really just primarily in opposition to all things Republican Democrat, but who are primarily Northerners who are opposed to slavery, either because they believe it's morally wrong or because they believe that it is physically abusive to other people. Now, again, there's this delicate balance of power, what we call this, sectional crisis, right? The country is divided, and you'll see a map of that in just a moment. The country is very divided on whether or not states should be slave or free, but the opinion is also very divided on whether or not slavery should or shouldn't exist and whether or not it should or should not be protected. Remember, the rule for the territories is that slavery does not exist in the territory. However, it is protected and fugitive slaves must be returned. So Zachary Taylor's suggestion changes this law and says now slavery will be allowed in the territory as long as California is a free state. So this is immediately an unpopular idea for Northerners and Southerners. So the fight for California really begins to take place at the same time that we're seeing a lot of other congressional debates taking place, particularly conflicts over slavery and problems in Texas. Remember, Texas has been trying to come into the Union, but parts of Texas are free, parts of Texas are not free. Parts of Texas are still heavily inhabited by non-Americans, if you will. And so this is a really volatile time in congressional politics. So Henry Clay, you may recall Henry Clay, who was the nullification senator from Texas. I'm sorry, the nullification senator from Kentucky. Henry Clay proposed a compromise, and Henry Clay, again, as this nullification senator, believed that if a state did not like a federal law, the state should be able to write their own law that was in contrast to the federal law, bring it to a vote in the state Congress, vote on it, and if it was passed, that the state should be able to ignore a federal law. Now, that might sound a little bit silly today in the current time. However, states are still doing this today. They're making their own laws that are in violation of federal law. So Henry Clay proposes a compromise to settle this issue. And the compromise would first admit California to the Union as a free state. It would grant popular sovereignty to resolve any slavery issues in the remaining land that is acquired from Mexico. So popular sovereignty is the idea that the people who live in the area would get to decide if slavery would or not exist. The people would decide, they would pass a law, and that law would be respected. That is a very anti-federalist, strong sort of states' rights idea. And then finally, he would write a new fugitive slave law. The compromise really offered something that would benefit everyone. It would benefit Southerners, it would benefit Northerners, and it would benefit the folks in California who wanted the state to become part of the Union. But it's not immediately popular. Senators on both sides of the slavery issue opposed the compromise, and Congress actually adjourned that year without ever deciding the fate of California. But there are some developments that take place in 1850 that really shift the political landscape. So those developments, those changes are first that Henry Clay retires. By this point, Henry Clay is aging and really not able to continue. So he retires. John Calhoun, who had originally opposed the compromise, passed away. President Zachary Taylor also passes away. So Zachary Taylor's death moves Millard Fillmore into the presidency. Millard Fillmore appoints Daniel Webster, who had actually supported the compromise, to his own cabinet. This, of course, creates an empty seat in the Senate, Daniel Webster's seat. So those changes in the Senate, as well as Fillmore's support for the measure, allows for this compromise to be pushed through Congress. And the passage of this, again, we're admitting California as a free state. We are allowing popular sovereignty, so the individual territories, when they apply for statehood, will get to decide if they are going to be slave or free states, and this new Fugitive Slave Act. Those things sort of temporarily resolve the issue. But maybe most importantly, what they do not do is settle the question of slavery. So slavery is still a very, very divisive issue. So I want to talk about the Fugitive Slave Act because this is going to become the proverbial catalyst of 1850, although most did not realize it in 1850. So the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is part of the 1850 Compromise, and it strengthened and harshened the previous fugitive slave laws. In part because what it does is forces individual citizens to be responsible for enforcing the fugitive slave law. Now, remember that slaves had to be returned to their masters if they ran away into the Western Territory under the old fugitive slave law. But there wasn't really a punishment for those who helped slaves to run away, and there wasn't a requirement that they help to return those slaves. So Northerners feel like this is the federal government actually protecting slavery. They say that the federal government is protecting the way of life of certain states, but not all states. And prior to the Fugitive Slave Act, free blacks and many whites allied together and fought against slavery. And so this new Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 makes it very, very difficult. The Fugitive Slave Act, though, does increase the number of Northern abolitionists who begin to help blacks escape enslavement via the Underground Railroad. One provision, and this is very important, of the Fugitive Slave Act made free blacks very vulnerable to being kidnapped or arrested as runaways. The commissioners, which were kind of the bounty hunters who would go out and retrieve the runaway slaves, commissioners were paid $10 for sending a black slave back to the South, but they were paid only $5 if the slave was not returned. And it should sound offensive, but most commissioners did not make any distinction between a slave or a free black. What they saw was a black person who could be sold back into the South. For slave owners, their focus was obviously to have the slave that had escaped returned for a variety of reasons, but their objective, of course, was to replace the missing labor force. And so any black, free or slaved, original slave of the master or not, was less important than keeping the plantation running. Abolitionists protested the slave law and worked very hard to free the fugitive slaves who had actually been arrested. Now, for those in the northern areas and in the western areas who had been able to ignore slavery, pretend it didn't exist, and who had not seen the harshness of slavery, what the fugitive slave law does is forces them to pick a side. Now they can't remain neutral, right? Because if they try to remain neutral, then they're really siding with whichever side they don't support. So if you are opposed to slavery, but you try to remain neutral, under the fugitive slave law, then you have to become complicit in slavery and help return slaves. If you support slavery, if you're neutral on the issue of slavery, and you don't return slaves, then you are ultimately picking a side. And so for those who tried to kind of stay out of the issue, they really are forced to pick a side. You may have heard the adage, the road is riddled with dead squirrels who couldn't make a decision. Well, now people are going to have to make a decision. They're going to have to decide if they support slavery or they oppose slavery. So despite the negative reactions of the foreign governments to the new fugitive slave law, as well as to the violence that had pervaded the institution of slavery, Northern abolitionists and Southern slaveholders proved completely unwilling to make any further compromises. There were two major parties who attempted to avoid the issue of slavery in 1852, just as they had in the previous elections. The Democrats nominated Franklin Pierce, who was a Northerner and opposed abolition. Now, this is important to understand. Not all Northerners supported abolition or getting rid of slavery. Some didn't, tried to not have an opinion. Some were living in the North, but didn't necessarily believe that slavery should be ended. The Whigs nominated General Winfield Scott, who was a Southerner, but a Southerner who kept quiet on the issue of slavery. So again, he's trying to remain neutral. The Free Soil Party, which has sort of reinvented itself from the Liberty Party, they really didn't seize the opportunity to stir up frustrations in the North over the Fugitive Slave Act. And they nominated a man named John P. Hale, who was really a very, very unknown senator from, who was an unknown senator who had really not done very much. No one really knew who he was. Of course, Franklin Pierce is successful. And part of that is really because he's just in the physical location to garner the most votes. Franklin Pierce, his victory really kind of leaves the Whigs and the Free Soilers as individual parties in disarray. They're going to need to reinvent themselves, they're going to need to rebrand themselves, but most importantly, they're going to need to pick a side, and they're going to need to have a clear platform on the issue of slavery. Pierce was very inexperienced, and he had a very splintered or very fractured cabinet. And so as a result of this, he really gets a lot of conflicting advice. And so he's hearing a lot of different things in terms of slavery. And so he basically just sort of ignores them and trusts his own views and follows a very, very expansionist vision for the United States. From the start of his administration, Pierce worked to extend the U.S. trade and does succeed in expanding U.S. trade and commercial and diplomatic ties with Japan. So this is the beginning of the United States' very, very interesting economic relationship with Japan. Franklin Pierce also attempts to extend the U.S. empire into the Caribbean and Central America. But there's a lot of division in the United States, and that really undermines his attempts to acquire Cuba from Spain. Now, Pierce is really an expansionist. He's not necessarily looking to extend slavery as much as he's looking to expand the United States empire and the United States sort of role in the world. Many politicians, including those in Pierce's cabinet, tried to get him to annex or bring Cuba into the United States. And they sort of justified this as what they call the Ostend Manifesto. But Northerners, right, when they hear that Cuba might come into the United States, they immediately believe that Cuba will come into the United States as a slave state, and they are fearful that this will, again, tip that very, very, very fragile balance of power between free states and slaveholding states in the United States. And so they immediately object to this. So Pierce is not able to recognize and realize his goals regarding expansion. However, his attempts to expand the empire, again, just cause some things to be shaken up in the country, and it produces much, much more sectional conflict in the United States. We are becoming very, very divided as a nation on the issue of slavery. The issue of slavery is also becoming a personal issue, as well as a stronger political issue at this time.